Thank you for joining us tonight for our celebration of beloved global icon, actor, martial artist, and philosopher Bruce Lee. Before we begin, as a land-grant institution, the Film and Television Archive at UCLA would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. We are humbled to do work in this community. We would like to thank the individuals and organizations who helped make tonight's screening possible. All of the archive screenings in the Wilder are free thanks to a gift from an anonymous donor, and we are grateful to their support and to the Hammer Museum for their wonderful partnership. This screening has been made possible by the John H. Mitchell Television Programming Endowment, with special thanks to our community partners, the Bruce Lee Foundation and the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. Thanks to, absolutely. We also want to thank Sydney Wilson of the Bruce Lee Foundation, Peter Murray of CBS, Patrick Lockney at the Packard Humanities Institute, and Eda Manriquez and Taylor Morales of the Academy Film Archive. We'd also like to let's please give those tremendous folks a round of applause. Some figures loom large in Asian American culture, and though Bruce Lee had passed away well before I was born, his presence and impact were a formidable part of my childhood. In contrast to representations of Asian Americans, which always fell short, was Bruce Lee. I felt drawn to Bruce Lee, and not just because my grandfather had given me his haircut, but because there's a real photo of that. But because I'll show you later. But because he was powerful, sharp, and charming, a true icon, Bruce Lee's influence positively changed Asian American culture and history, and I'm just so grateful to that. I want to also thank somebody who's special, who's here today, Shannon Lee. Mark is going to introduce Shannon a little bit more later in the Q&A, but before we get started, I'd like to share with you a little bit about Mark Quigley. He's, again, our television curator, and he's been the driving force of this amazing program. So I want to thank him and bring him up on stage to introduce the rest of the evening.
Thank you, May, and thank you, Shannon Lee, so much for being here. Executive producer of the television program Warrior, founder and director of the Bruce Lee Foundation, and keeper of the flame for Bruce Lee. So we're just extremely grateful and honored to have you here. Screening first tonight is the debut episode of the ABC detective series Longstreet, titled The Way of the Intercepting Fist from 1971, which is a remarkable primetime showcase for Lee's deeply personal philosophies and his charisma and prowess as an actor. Rather than screen from standard definition network sources, we are screening from an HD scan of the archive's imperfect 1971 network print of an ABC rebroadcast from 1972, which has the bonus of original commercials. This 60mm print was completely color faded, so special thanks to our digital lab team and Randy Yuntek for their restoration efforts. Following Longstreet, we will ask Shannon to please join me on stage for a discussion and Q&A about tonight's screening selections and how they relate to her essential book, Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee, and her amazing work with the Bruce Lee Foundation. And following the Q&A, after a brief intermission, we will screen a 35mm Technicolor die print of the cult classic Enter the Dragon, courtesy of our dear friends at the Academy Film Archive. If you have never seen Enter the Dragon, it is simply put one of the greatest martial arts films ever made and one of the best films made in the 70s. And if you have seen the film before, tonight we'll ask you to watch through a different lens, beyond the action and towards the life lessons that Mr. Lee imparts, which I greatly look forward to hearing Shannon speak about. And as a bonus feature, we will start with a few brief but meaningful archival treasures from Bruce Lee's TV career. Thank you so much, Shannon, for being here. It means the world to us. Thank you all for being here and braving the rain, and please enjoy the show. Please welcome to the stage executive producer, author, and co-founder and director of the Bruce Lee Foundation, Shannon Lee.
Leaving things everywhere.
Thank you again, Shannon, so much for being here. It's so great to have you at the Billy Wilder Theater.
Oh my gosh, it is absolutely my pleasure. That was so fun to watch. So good.
The writing credit is Sterling Silliphant, who was an Academy Award winner for In the Heat of the Night, but those words are your father's, and that philosophy is his.
Yes.
Should have had a writing credit, for certain.
Yeah.
And the origin, or Bruce Lee's origin story, those words go back to a fateful boat ride that he had as a teenager.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. You know, the Be Water quote, as you know, makes an appearance there in that TV show. And interestingly, the origin of that and my father's relationship with water goes back to when he was a teenager in Hong Kong, and he was a student of Ip Man's. And he was, you know, a rambunctious teenager, as you can imagine, and always trying to sort of do his best and win in class and be very aggressive and enforce his own strategy when practicing and sparring and all that kind of thing. And his teacher kept saying to him, you know, stop being so aggressive, so much yang, not enough yin, not enough gentleness. You know, you have to go with your opponent and all this sort of thing. And you know, that whole free your ambitious mind, right? And my father just couldn't get it. I mean, he was a teenager, right? And so Yip Man said, don't come back for a week. Don't practice. Just go home. Which to my father is like, you know, death, because he was so active as a human being in general. So he did not go back to class, but he did try to practice on his own and really tried to get what his teacher was saying. And in a bout of frustration, he went out in a boat on the harbor, and he was thinking about, you know, what am I missing? What am I not getting? And he was so angry, and he started punching the water. And it was right in that moment when he was like, oh, light bulb, you know, and he wrote about it, which I write about in my book, but he wrote about it in an essay. And he was saying, you know, and in that moment, I realized this is what he means, to be like water. I punch the water, and the water moves out of the way of my fist. I try to grab the water, and it runs through my hands, you know? And so this is the place of gentleness. This is me being present and actually following what my opponent is doing rather than being caught up in my own mind with my sticky thoughts of only myself, right? And that in fact, in the next moment, he saw this bird fly over, and he saw its reflection on the water, and he said, And then I saw this bird and its reflection, and I realized that my thoughts and my emotions need to be like the reflection of the bird on the water when in my mind. Like, I notice them, they're there, but I don't get stuck on them. I let them pass through. So,
And so much of that you write about in your book has practical applications for how we live our lives in 2023. And so I think when we think of Bruce Lee, we think about his physical abilities that are immeasurable, but he worked his mind as hard as he worked his body.
right. Yeah, that's exactly. So, the Bruce Lee Foundation, which is our charitable arm of what we do, has really started to make a real efforts toward youth mental wellness in a mind, body, spirit way through the teachings of my father. And the reason for that is exactly that, is my father trained his mind just as much, if not more, than he trained his body. And we all know what his body looked like, right? So, and I always tell people the reason he made such impact, the reason he was so unique, the reason he had so much energy that just seemed to like pop off of the screen at you is because of that personal work, that mental work, that emotional work that he did on himself. And that when you look at him, you see someone and you feel someone who's very vital and therefore very real. And it gave him the strength, the inner strength, not the outer strength, the inner strength to be able to do what he did in this life.
That's something you talk about in your book a lot, is the idea of being real and how important that was to him. But how can we bring these elements into our own lives? So many of us are never going to be Bruce Lee, but no one is going to be Bruce Lee. That's impossible to replicate. But
Yeah.
some of his lessons have such practical application. So this idea that you come out in your book numerous times about being real, how does that apply to us in this digital, self-serving, sometimes social media age?
Well, one of the things is that my father always talked about, and I'm sure many of you know this, is he would say, don't go out and look for a successful personality and duplicate that. But don't go for self-image actualization, go for self-actualization. Start from the very root of your being and say to yourself, how can I be me? When I have struggled throughout my life with being Bruce Lee's daughter, the thing I always remind myself is he doesn't want me to be him. He wants me to be me. And he wants all of you to be you. And that by developing who you are, you actually are developing and cultivating the most unique thing that you have. Because we're all slightly different, right? We all share a humanity, but the way we express who we are on the inside, we're made up of all these different experiences. We grew up in different places. We have different, experiences throughout our life that shape us. And so we're all slightly different in the way we view the world and the talents that we have, the different things that the different ways that we think and feel. And that by cultivating that, we're cultivating something 100% unique, like he did for himself. And in that way, we can be real by being ourselves.
And embodied in that philosophy was the idea of going back to water, of not being still, of having action as a way of self-actualization.
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say is he did sometimes talk about stillness, and he would say, actually, the real stillness is the stillness in movement. So it's like we're living, breathing organisms, right? Like we're never truly still. We're breathing. Our hearts are beating, But the stillness that we want to have is inside, We want to have a centeredness, a certain amount of peaceful reservoir that we can return to. Because when we hold that stillness inside, we actually are free to move in any direction. Like, you think about something that has momentum, it's hard to get it to stop and change direction. But if it's still, it can move in any direction. And so he would say, you know, we're sort of like, that's what we strive for, is in our being, is to be this person that is doing and you know, moving through different actions and things like that, but from a place of peacefulness on the inside. And as we all know, it's hard to be peaceful on the inside. But that's where the work comes in, right? To sort of like uncover, you know, the cause of your ignorance, as he said, right? The things you don't know, the things you need to know about yourself and heal about yourself so that you can achieve that sense of calm.
And while the world is swirling around you, you're centered and not reacting, but living in the moment and being ready to accept the moment as it happens. And spontaneity being such a big part of that too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in my book, I talk about the difference between reacting and responding, right? Like, language is such a difficult thing, but the way that I differentiate between those two words is that a reaction is an unconscious thing. You know, you immediately respond with whatever your pattern of you know, your habitual response is to something. But when you can sort of step back a moment and create that small amount of space, that small amount of stillness within yourself, and be able to observe yourself as a human being, then you, in that moment, can, instead of react, you can consider at lightning speed, you know, how you would like to respond, and then respond in that way.
And this is completely tied also to his fighting style.
Yes. I mean, we just watched a whole, you know, dissertation on it, basically, in that episode. Yeah, you know, it really is. And that's the thing about him, is that he brought philosophy to his martial art. He brought it to how he lived his life. He brought it to everything that he did. And that he wanted to move through the world and move through his art in a way that was meaningful, that had meaning for him, which is where philosophy comes in.
And for his life, him living his life as an artist, but his life being his work of art.
Yes, and in fact, you know, he said himself in an essay that he wrote several drafts of called In My Own Process, that he never published. This was, he wrote this essay in 1970, end of 72, beginning of 73. It was just, had been shooting Game of Death and was about to engage in Enter the Dragon. And in that essay, he said, you know, about being real, that he really felt like one of the greatest goals and accomplishments that he could ever have was for someone to look at him and say, now there is someone real. And I think that he did that. And in that same essay, he said, I am a martial artist by choice, an actor by profession, but what I really am is an artist of life.
And within that is the idea of accepting other people as they are, being open to people as they are, and the entire idea of being present each day, that this life isn't something, the thing that we're building towards is something we're going to achieve tomorrow, but living in today.
Yeah, I mean, he had this great quote, which is so simplistic on its face, but he said, the meaning of life is that it is to be lived. You know? And if you think about being your most alive, right? Like, you're really in the moment. you're really present. You're really engaged with what's going on. You're sensing the whole room and your body and your feelings and your thoughts. But rather than getting like all caught up in it, you're just allowing the moment and being as natural as you can in that presence. And that is being our most alive.
And something I think you describe as living in the void.
Yes. My book gets sort of into, as my dad did, got a lot into, he called it the living void. And that's sort of what I mean by that stillness. He would talk about emptiness, right? Empty your mind. And that emptiness is that stillness, is that void, right? It's like before there's something, there's nothing. But that doesn't mean that the nothing is literally nothing, that it's empty. In fact, it's full of the possibility of everything. And that's what the living void is. It's like that place from which that spontaneity, that creativity, that moment, that action comes from. And so if we can be at one with that and be present with that and be in charge of what we're creating out of that, then we can, honestly express ourselves, as he would say.
And so a 70s TV show has like certain kitsch value to it.
For sure.
But when we're talking about the idea of an empty cup,
Yeah.
exactly what does that mean?
Yeah, that's what it means. It's like, when he says empty your mind, he's basically saying empty the cup of your mind. Don't walk through the world with your judgments, your preconceived ideas, your opinions, but walk through the world with more emptiness so that you can experience what's actually happening and not just experience it through the lens of your judgment. Because when you experience the world through, which, by the way, we all do, right? We're all human beings. But when you walk through the world that way, through the lens of your judgment, you're limited in what you're actually experiencing because you're trying to make the world match your perspective and your point of view and your belief and your judgment. And when you hold on to that, you're actually looking for evidence that you're right rather than just looking, right?
So as your family's historian and archivist, along with your mom, you can trace your father's ascent by his following his philosophies and adapting to the obstacles that were thrown in front of him. So even to get to Longstreet, let's talk a little bit about his career at this point and how his philosophies shaped what would end up being some life-changing decisions that he made.
Yeah, so, my father was struggling quite a bit in Hollywood. He had done The Green Hornet, as we all saw the commercial for, and that show was canceled. And he was really trying to get more roles, but he didn't want to take roles that were demeaning or stereotypical, which meant that there weren't very many. And, he had all these great friends, like Sterling Sylvan was his good friend, and Ted Ashley, who was the head of Warner Brothers, and James Coburn, and Steve McQueen, and all these people, right? But, it was, even with all that, it was really hard for him to get taken seriously. It was a time where, people were still performing in yellowface in film and television, right? Having Caucasians play Asians. And so it was very hard for him to get good roles, meaty roles, even though he tried, and he tried writing his own projects, as we know, The Silent Flute and The Warrior, and just was not getting anywhere. And so he left and went to Hong Kong to see if he could do something there. And in Hong Kong, the Green Hornet was called the Kato Show. And he was, hometown kid made good in Hollywood because he was an actor when he was a child. And so he had in the minds of his community, he had gone to Hollywood and made it, right? And so there was a desire to have him be in films in Hong Kong. And, James Coburn was primarily one of the people who advocated to him for doing that because, like Clint Eastwood had gone and done the spaghetti westerns in Italy and been able to make a name for himself. He thought, well, maybe I can do the same. And so he had gone to do the first film, Big Boss, and off of the success of that, he was, able to start getting a little bit more recognition, and he was able to work with Sterling Silliphant to be able to do this episode of Longstreet.
But the obstacles that Hollywood provided didn't stop him from achieving stardom, which was something that he had outlined in his goals that he was going to do. And he managed to go around Hollywood. Anybody with eyes could see that he had the charisma and the ability to be a star on American television. Mm-hmm. But it was actually fortuitous in some ways that didn't happen.
Yes. No, it's true. I mean, if you think about it, if he had gotten The Warrior Maid or Kung Fu or, whatever, and starred in that show, then he would not have been globally known, right? He would have been known in this country on a TV show, but he would not have had the global recognition that he ended up having because he went to Hong Kong to do those films. And, he employed his philosophy, which was to be like water, rather than just keep banging his head against the wall and trying to make something happen that was clearly not happening. He found a different path.
And in that path, we'll set up Enter the Dragon just a little bit. Again, finding resistance, even among, there was allies like Ted Ashley, but there was people that needed convincing that the things that were most important to Bruce Lee, which was thinking, not just the physical abilities, but the intellectual part of it, that there was a part for that in Enter the Dragon.
Yeah, when he first got the script for Enter the Dragon, which was called Blood and Steel, it didn't have any of the philosophical stuff, as you can imagine, that was in there. And but my father, because he had this goal, which he stated in the Pierre Burton interview and clearly in other ways, of bringing an authentic representation of an Asian man to the West, to Hollywood. So when he got this offer finally from Warner Brothers to be able to do this film, it was really it was the opportunity he'd been looking for. But he wanted to make it the best possible opportunity that he could, and so the way he wanted to do that was by making sure that some of his philosophy and some of his culture and some of his, thoughts about martial arts and all of that got its way into the film. But, initially they were like, no, just do the movie, right? And he worked tirelessly writing scenes, didn't get a writing credit on that either, by the way. And the producers were like, yeah, it'll be fine. We'll put the stuff in. And when it came time to shoot, he got the shooting script, and none of the stuff that he had written was in the script. And so he refused to go to set. And then he was. There was a standoff that took place for a couple of weeks, actually. And it's funny, I talked to my mom about it, and I said, was he really going to just tank that opportunity? Because, we all live in Hollywood, right? It's like, oh my gosh, you think if I could just get my foot in the door, right, then maybe next time the role will be better. And she said absolutely he was not going to make that movie unless they put the things in that he wanted. He was willing to let it go. And so this standoff went on for a couple of weeks. They tried to shoot as much of they had the whole crew and everybody there. They shot everything they could without him, and then finally they had to concede, and we have the film that we have today because of it.
And I think if the movie was just the fight scenes, of course, we'd still be talking about it today, 50-some years later. But the fact that it has these philosophical scenes makes you understand his character so much greater. And there's such an insight into him and his beliefs. So without spoilers, let's talk about, we're going to be looking at the original theatrical version. So the scene that was added for the 25th anniversary, the scene with the monk is a really important illustrative scene that's not going to be in what we see tonight. Mm-hmm. But maybe let's talk a little bit about the parts in the movie to look out for.
Sure. There's the scene that I call Lau's Time, right? It's Lau's Time, where he teaches the student, that has the great, finger pointing at the moon, don't concentrate on the finger. I love that scene. I do a whole breakdown of it in my book from a philosophical standpoint and what's so important about it and how you can apply what he's talking about there to your own life. And that's one scene that he wrote, and I just think it's such an impactful scene. It's so few words, but it illustrates so much. It's similar to Longstreet, but more refined, because he's talking about, relationship, like when he kept saying to James Franciscus, relationship, it's you and me, don't just, hit, like, listen, where am I? And there's a same similar idea in that scene, but it's done just so simplistically and yet so powerfully, and it's also funny. He's smacking the kid on the head and all that kind of stuff. So there's that scene. There's the art of fighting without fighting. There's that scene. There's the scene, at the end with the mirror. I don't know. I think this print probably doesn't have the voiceover in it either.
Which part are you referring to?
In the mirror, the
yeah,
final
I don't
mirror
think it
scene.
does.
Yeah, I don't think it does either, because that's from the beginning part with the monk, right? So, and just there are a number of different parts to it. They also hadn't, the very opening scene, the fight with Sammo Hung, that had not been. That's not philosophical necessarily, but that had not been. Originally was not the opening of the film. My father shot that, and it was added in at the end to be the opening of the film. And, just him, the whole scene with the sister and what that represented, and going to the gravesite and talking to his father and all of that. All of those things were things that he incorporated into the film.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the film for certain. So all of these philosophies that we see in Longstreet, in Enter the Dragon, and also just in a film like Fist of Fury, where he, one of the most memorable scenes in his career, where he kicks down a racist son. All of these things form the Bruce Lee that people love, that's so far beyond his physical abilities. So how big was his library?
How big was his library? So we just sent my father's books, his book collection, up to the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle. If you're up there and you get a chance to go, I recommend it. It was over 2,800 books, many of them underlined and annotated in as well. And he liked to do what he called prescriptive reading. So I want to say of the 2,800 plus books, there's like 5 novels. Although, interestingly, quite a bit of poetry. Because as we know, he liked to write poetry himself. But he called it prescriptive reading because he liked to read about the things that he wanted to know more about. So there are many books on philosophy, many books on, it is got to be the biggest collection of books on fighting arts that one person has. My father loved to browse the old bookstores, the old used bookstores, and look for out-of-print volumes. He had every single manual on training from every faction of the military, the Boy Scouts, like any book on training, fighting, combat, all different styles, all different things, he had it.
And how much writing did he leave behind?
He wrote a lot, amazingly, and like for instance, I don't know if you all know the story that he injured his back quite seriously at one point. In 1969, he injured his back right toward the end of 68, 69. He injured his back working out, and it was a very debilitating injury, and he had to be on bed rest for a few months, which for him is really difficult. But he always used his time. That was the thing. And he would say, if you love life, don't waste time, because time is what life is made up of. And so he read a ton during that time, and he wrote a ton during that time. So many of the writings that we have are from that time when he was laying in bed and injured. And to give you some idea of what it is, we have in our archive 7 volumes just on his thoughts and ideas on martial arts, which ended up making up the bulk of the Tao of Jeet Kune Do and Bruce Lee's fighting methods. Those books, all those books were published posthumously. And that was just some of the writings on martial arts. And then, tons of philosophical writings. He used to carry affirmations in his pocket with him during the day. People think of affirmations as kind of like this, hippie thing that, whatever people do. Well, Bruce Lee did it. He had these cards, and he had beautiful penmanship where he wrote down how he wanted the nutritious mental food that he wanted to feed his mind on a daily basis. And he carried it in his pocket. And he would pull it out and read it throughout the day. This is how I want to remind myself to go through life.
And on top of everything else, he had amazing penmanship.
He did. He had beautiful penmanship. My father was really a Renaissance man. He was extremely creative. He wrote ideas for TV and film. He wrote philosophical essays. He wrote articles. He wrote all about his theories of martial arts. He could draw beautifully. He drew, detailed fighting techniques, but also beautiful images of dragons and, all sorts of... He wrote poetry. He designed jewelry. He designed some of his own jewelry. He designed workout equipment that didn't exist that he wanted. He had clothes made for him. He used to shop at Fred Siegel here in LA, which I think is still around. Was one of his favorite stores. But he was always up on, fashion. And he was really like a Renaissance man, creating himself and moving through life, expressing himself.
And I think your book perfectly captures and traces not only your father's history and journey, but your family's journey and your personal journey through all of it. You talk in the book that your dad did collect and read self-help books, all kinds.
Yep.
And the truth is, as you know, all of that distilled into so much action that he was able to get out of it. And I think your book is a great distillation and has so much practical application. Self-help book in the greatest possible way, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the whole reason I wrote the book is because my father's, and really the whole reason I do what I do of looking after my father's legacy. And 2023 is 50 years since he passed. So, you know, the reason that I do this is because his writings, his words, his teachings have helped me. They have healed me. You know, I mean, obviously I lost him when I was 4, and then I lost my brother right before my 24th birthday. And I'm just a human being with, you know, trying to figure stuff out like we all are. And it was a lot. And it was his writings that started to turn the switch on for me in terms of the idea that I could help myself. And it was actually my favorite quote that I was given copies of his writings, which were probably like, you know, photocopied pages, is all stacked up like this high. And I started sort of flipping through them, and I'm like, oh, there's the bee water. Yeah, oh, there's that, you know, looking. And I came across this quote that I had never heard before. And, you know, this was probably a year or two after my brother had died, and I was in a very dark place. And I came across this quote, and it said, "The medicine for my suffering I had within me from the very beginning, but I did not take it. My ailment came from within myself, but I did not observe it until this moment. And now I see, if I am to find the light, I must be like the candle and be my own fuel." And there was just something about when I read that, I think because it said the medicine for my suffering. I was like, there's medicine for my suffering? Like, what is it? And it's like, well, you have it. It's inside of you. You just have to find it. And it just set me on a course. And because I could see, you know, his legacy was living on perfectly fine without me, and it would be living on perfectly fine without me. But I could see that we were losing the philosophy. You know, it was all like martial arts and action films, which are awesome and which will go on forever. But we were kind of losing like the foundation of it all, which was his personal work, which was what made his martial arts and his action films so great. And so I've sort of made it my mission to make sure that that part not only survives, but gets out there as much as possible.
And sharing it through the foundation.
Thank you.
And sharing it especially with children, which is amazing because there's so much there to get and to learn. I think what we'd like to do now is take a couple of quick questions from the audience, give the audience a chance to talk to you. So we're going to take just like one or two, and I would love a question about philosophy, if somebody had one about Bruce Lee's philosophy. It's really hard to see up here, so if you raise your hand really high, and where's the microphones? Okay, there we go. There's somebody that looks really eager in the front row here, so let's go with this gentleman, please, and we're going to take one from the back after that.
Hi, I'm Pierre. I'm an agent. I brought a few clients here. This is terrific. Question, because we were talking about the script and his philosophy, and obviously Longstreet was a television show that was written by a writer. How much of his own lines and script was from him, and incorporate it into the script. So was there a collaboration between him and the writers? I was just curious how that was about. And my second question was about you. You have this great style and the way you handle yourself and the way you talk. Did that just come from him, or maybe how you developed that? So those are my two questions.
Thank you for your questions. Yes, the writer of Longstreet was a man named Sterling Silliphant, who was a friend and student of my father's. So yes, all of those lines of dialogue are really from my father. Based on Jeet Kune Do. I mean, they say Jeet Kune Do in the show, so it was all his beliefs, and we have numerous writings of a very similar nature in our archive, because this was the kind of thing he was thinking about and writing about all the time. And there was a project called The Silent Flute that never got made, that he co-wrote with Sterling Silliphant also, and James Coburn. The three of them were supposed to do that together. So yes, he worked very closely with the writer, and they basically wrote that episode for him, which was great. And thank you. For myself, I am a person very much like my father. I was saying this to Mark earlier. Yes, I've studied martial arts, but where my father and I intersect the most is in the philosophy, and not just philosophy per se in terms of like studying philosophy, but in the way of personal growth and really trying to understand life and myself and how to move through life and be as alive and joyous and real and centered as I possibly can. And in that way, I think we shared that very much. Whether it's in the genetics or not, I don't know. But I've definitely spent a lot of time around it. So, and it's also a point of like, my personal practice is I want to try to feel, well, first of all, I want to try to be myself whenever I can and in every situation. And I also want to feel as comfortable as possible. So my practice has become, as I've gained in my own inner strength and confidence, to actually really feel into the discomfort. And where there is discomfort, to really try to get to the root of it and say, well, what is this really? And how do I heal it so that I can become more whole and in that way more comfortable in my own skin?
Yeah. I don't want to be like an infomercial, but I think the book is extremely helpful. And I'll just say that some of the lessons about spontaneity, like I brought notes on stage, but I also decided to go with some of the teachings in the book, and I didn't look at my notes and wanted to just see if we could have a conversation in the now. And I think it worked out okay. So I'm happy about that. Take one way in the back there. There's a hand that's really high.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask about Sterling. Were 4 episodes the total amount that was planned for your father to be on Longstreet? And secondly, how did he respond to his American co-stars like James Franciscus and John Saxon and Van Williams and Wendy Wagner and Marlon Mason?
It was not planned for him to be on more than one episode initially, but his episode was very popular, and so they wrote him into a few more, which was great. But then he really couldn't continue on because he was very busy, as we know, making other movies in Hong Kong at the time. My dad got along with. He really well. Let me put it this way. He really wanted to always be himself also. And he was very charismatic. And he loved to really connect with people, And he really liked the people that he worked with for the most part, right? I mean, whether he liked them as like he would want them to be best friends and hang out at dinner and all that every day, I can't really say. But I know that he really earnestly tried to connect with everyone that he encountered. And of all of those people, I think he probably I don't think he really hung out with James Franciscus much, other than on the show, or any of those other people, other than maybe John Saxon a bit. But he'd only just gotten to know John in Enter the Dragon, and then he passed away, before the film was even released. So, but they got on quite well, and
Thank you.
yeah, he got on with everyone he tried to.
So Shannon, I'm going to give you the last word before we take a short break before Enter the Dragon. What would you like to leave us with as we approach the next thing for Bruce Lee that you're going to do?
The next thing for Bruce Lee that I'm going to do? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I mean, moving forward, like you've got your book and you're working with the foundation, but what do you see the future for you and Bruce Lee?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I think that there is so much good, meaningful stuff when it comes to Bruce Lee, like his philosophies, his teachings, who he was, how he moved through the world, how he tried to fight for representation and harmony amongst our human family. And I really hope to see that have him gain and even more in recognition for that. And I think it's funny. It's like a double-edged sword, because Bruce Lee is so cool and he's so awesome and he's so badass and all that kind of stuff. And all of the like really thoughtful intellectual stuff is kind of like the real secret weapon. And but sometimes people don't put those two together, right? They just think, oh, popcorn, action movies, Bruce Lee, kitsch, whatever, 70s. But the people who really know, they really know, right? And I'd really, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I really wanted him to be recognized for the philosopher that he really was. I mean, it's not just a handful of quotes, y'all. Like, it's a lot of writings. Deep, thoughtful writings about how to live life, and how to not just live life, but how to be yourself at the deepest level. And so I want to keep having fun, because Bruce Lee's about having fun, right? And excitement and action. Like, one of the things that I love about my dad is that, like, I'll be wearing, I'm not that recognizable out in the world, so I'll be wearing a Bruce Lee t-shirt because I got a lot of Bruce Lee t-shirts. And someone will come up to me wherever, at the airport, on the street, and they'll be like, "Oh my God, I love your shirt." And I'm like, yes. It's such a great feeling. People who love Bruce Lee, like the feeling is uplifting. And I want that to continue.
I think it's going to, long after all of us in this room are gone.
Yeah. I hope so.
Please thank Shannon Lee for joining us.